Lovely. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. And I thought I'd just give a little bit of background to this because just to give you a sense of where it's coming from. 3 years ago in 2019, I presented a paper at the inaugural days of the Centre for the Study of the Bible and Violence at Bristol Baptist College. And I presented a paper on Samson the suicide bomber, which I was then asked to write up in a bit more detail and appeared in a rather weighty tome they published. And that got me thinking really about a number of other parts of the Old Testament, particularly that I've been concerned about, like Abraham and Isaac that we're looking at tonight, like genocide, which we're looking at next week. And it led me to write these 3 studies, which are available, as you may have seen or may not have seen, on the Centre's website. I called it Reading the Bible Responsibly, not because I think that unless we read it this way, we're reading it irresponsibly, but it's just a reminder that we do have a responsibility when we read the Bible. And part of that responsibility is having a sense of how other people see it. And part of what I think will come out for the next 3 weeks is that stories that a lot of church people take for granted actually are quite disturbing. And I know when I mentioned to my wife that I was doing something on Samson, she said, "Oh, it's a great Sunday school story." And yes, it is. A lot of people would say that, but it's also a horrendous story that has, as I'll say in 2 weeks' time, has frightening resemblances to a suicide bomber. So this is about looking at the Bible in a different way, I guess, and seeing how other people might read it and what could be read out of it that is less helpful than we might think. This is slightly different. This is essentially adapted from the booklet that Vaughan has linked to on the website. So all the references on the PowerPoint, they will be in the booklet. I don't include the references on the PowerPoint because it just clutters it up and makes it less pleasant to read. But all the references, footnotes, are in the booklet. And I've slightly changed the steps. I think there are 3 steps in the booklet, but it seems to be 2 steps to this process, really. Firstly, reading the story and putting aside all that we've been taught to believe about it by the church, just reading it as a story and seeing what hits us. And then, secondly, to recognize the blind spot that prevents us seeing it as others see it and asking the questions about it that they do. And I think this will probably come clear as we look at the Abraham and Isaac story. I hope this will be as interactive as possible. So I've got lots of slides where there are questions for us to reflect on, talk about, think about. And if you've got questions that you want to add or to throw in, please do that. So, Abraham and Isaac, a very familiar story. And one, I confess, when I first again started thinking about writing on it, I mentioned it to a group of, I think it was lay ministers in training, and no one really had any problems with it. Well, yeah, Abraham and Isaac, yeah, Abraham was called to sacrifice Isaac and would have done, and yeah. And I think that's quite disturbing if people can read that story and not feel concerned.
Yes.
And that's really what I'm trying to say, that if we can read some of these stories and not feel rather concerned and rather unsettled by them, then maybe we need to reread them. So there are two readings, the one from Genesis, and then there's a short one from Hebrews where the writer picks up and commends what Abraham would have been prepared to do. So I wonder if it's going to be Harley, because Harley seems to be the usual culprit in this, but would somebody read Genesis 22 for us? I shall, when you get to the point where you need the next slide, I'll change it for you, so you won't be stuck with nothing to read. Harley, would you be willing to?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Sure, no worries. So, after these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham," and he said, "Here I am." He said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you." So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. he cut the wood for the burnt offering and set out and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place far away. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. So the two of them walked on together. Isaac said to his father Abraham, "Father," and he said, "Here I am, my son." He said, "The fire and the wood are here. Where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So the two of them walked on together. When they came to...
Oh, sorry, Harold.
Oh, sorry, no.
Not sure what happened there. I didn't do it, so yeah, sorry.
When they came to the place that God had shown him, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And it is said to this day, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will indeed bless you, and I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the land of the gate of their enemies. And by your offspring shall all the nations of the earth gain blessing for themselves, because you have obeyed my voice."
Thank you. And then there's just 3 verses from Hebrews.
Sure. I mean, I can do it as well, if you like.
Yes, please. Thank you.
No worries. By faith, Abraham, when put to the test, offered up Isaac. He who had received the promises was ready to offer up his only son, of whom he had been told, "It is through Isaac thy descendants shall be named for you." He considered the fact that God is able even to raise someone from the dead, and figuratively speaking, he did receive him back.
Thank you. So, excuse me. How do you react to this story? How does it leave you?
Well, me, it's always been I've always found it a difficult one. It's, I went to a church service once where they sort of preached it in such a way that that it was kind of like, you should have as much faith. It's like, well, but you wouldn't, but as soon as you actually do it in real life, you're a madman, it's just,
yeah.
But anyway,
so for some people, it is, as you say, it's about faith. And yet they seem to forget that actually there's a moral element to it too.
Was Abraham just having a bad dream?
Yeah.
I think so. Or that he was mentally ill for a little while, I think. He would never expect God, a loving God, to kill his son. No.
Well, that's exactly, that's why I asked the next question, does it fit in with what you believe about God?
No.
I think for a lot of us it doesn't, and that's the real problem, that why would the God that we believe in expect something like that?
He's on a bad day, basically. He had a bad day. Why not?
Yeah. Any other reactions? So is the Abraham of the story a good parent or a good exemplar of the faith?
I mean, you wouldn't think so if you were trying to tell someone why they should be a Christian. You wouldn't go to Abraham killing his son. or why they should be, why they should follow the Judaic faith, or you wouldn't go to, it wouldn't be my go-to.
And yet clearly, and if I can go back, sorry, I've gone forward, I meant to go back. If I can go back for the Hebrews, it's actually, he's commended. I mean, the context in Hebrews is this long list of people who did stuff out of faith in God, and things that implicitly the writer's commending, because they were up for doing this, even though they couldn't see what the point of it was. So clearly, even within the New Testament itself, Abraham is seen as an exemplar of the faith, which is disturbing, I think.
Surely he could have found another test for Abraham to do, couldn't he?
Yeah.
Surely.
That's an interesting point, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the even more disturbing facts about this is that Abraham, God had told Abraham that he would have descendants. And what he is, so he, not only is it's, God's relationship to Isaac, seemingly rather pathological, but also God's relationship with Abraham is pathological, because God starts saying to Abraham, well, you will have descendants, and this is obviously what, it seems to be Abraham's life goal, that he should have descendants, and then God says takes it all back as a test of obedience. So it all goes round in a sort of pathological circle, because God is promising to Abraham that if he obeys, then he will get descendants. And then God is saying to Abraham, now you in order to show that you obey me, you must kill your son Abraham, Abraham was the thing about which God was promising. So it's all really very strange and quite pathological.
Because it doesn't make sense, because it's like God's contradicting God's self and saying, well,
yes.
I promise you descendants, but you've got to kill the key to getting descendants, and yet I'm still promising them, and it just doesn't make any sense.
Is there sorry, I'm late, by the way. Is there any room for contextualization in terms of other faiths at the time offering child sacrifice, or having child sacrifice as part of their way of faith? And is there any room for the argument of God saying, so you think I'm like that? Let's see what happens. And then kind of pulls the plug at the last minute.
I think there is. I think there's I mean, in a way, it's that God changes his mind, it seems. But actually, I think the first part of the story, where God tests Abraham, it uses the name Elohim for God, and in the second part, it uses the name Yahweh. So I've heard the reading that, if you like, it is a transition, as Neil says, from a culture in which child sacrifice was seen to be acceptable into a culture where child sacrifice is not seen to be acceptable. And what God is doing is providing an alternative, i.e. animal sacrifice as an alternative to human sacrifice. I don't know if that...
I mean, certainly that's what some commentators say.
Yeah.
My inclination is to think that given the way the story is commended within the New Testament, and certainly even within the tradition, some of the early church fathers, as we'll see in a minute, are very up for taking it literally. I'm not sure that was intended, because clearly the writer to the Hebrews, if the writer to the Hebrews doesn't twig that was the point of it, I'm inclined to think that we're sort of trying to read something good out of a story that you can't read something good out of, but we can't ultimately know. But that would be my feeling.
Shouldn't he have asked? Sorry, shouldn't he have asked his wife about it? I mean,
Well, yes.
As a good parent.
Yes. I mean, it's a very male-dominated. It's a male god telling a man to sacrifice his son, and the mother, the wife and mother, stands in the background, like she does, to be fair, in most of the Old Testament. And that would be another story in itself.
Okay.
But very important, very, very important. So thank you. Very, very important. A few points, and as I say, the references to these are in the booklet. So if you want to follow them up, that's where the follow-up notes are. Alice Miller, who's a psychoanalyst, notes that Isaac's being turned into an object. So he's being dehumanized. So Isaac is purely the object of Abraham's faith or lack of faith. Another commentator asks, what are we to make of Abraham's silence when God demands that he sacrifice Isaac? If you recall 4 chapters earlier, when God talks about destroying Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham endlessly says, well, look, if you find X number of good people there, will you hold off? And the number goes down and down and down. So clearly Abraham is capable of arguing with God. But in this story, for some reason, when it's his nearest and dearest, he's docile and blindly obedient. And that makes it even more difficult to understand, even in terms of the logic of the story. That if you can argue with God on behalf of complete strangers, but not on behalf of his own son. And then the commentator also raises a question that, given the history of our times, is this a model of submissive faith that we want to encourage? Do we want to encourage this sort of idea of faith that basically you do what you believe God's telling you to do, whether it makes logical or moral sense at all? I'm not sure.
I mean, is there then an argument the other way around, that God is shocked that Abraham does what he does?
Oh, that's interesting.
But actually the test wasn't, are you going to do this? But, well, sorry, rephrase that. The test wasn't about how far will you go. The test was, are you even going to contemplate this?
That's interesting.
Do you think I'm that sort of God?
That's interesting. Yeah.
One thing.
Why would he bother to do that? Why would he bother? I mean.
Okay, well, I'm just thinking about the context again.
No, it's good. It's good.
Yeah, no, it's a good challenge. I think maybe it's do you think I'm like those other gods? Okay, go on then. This is what we do. And then oh my goodness, you're actually doing it.
I mean, yeah.
I don't know. I mean,
no, that whether it's what the original writer intended, it would be a very creative use of the story. And I think we can use the story in ways that goes beyond how it
yes, of course,
literally, and as a way of trying to understand what it might say to us today. There is a science fiction book, Dan Simmons' trilogy he wrote, and it refers to it in there. And the idea there, I think I'm right in remembering, is that it's actually Abraham testing God. Is that sort of a God? So there are all sorts of creative ways you can do stuff. And I guess with your background, Neil, in terms of poetry or drama, you could do things with it that actually was not necessarily a literal reading, but a very helpful alternative reading.
I'm more inclined to what Graham was saying earlier on about the test around the descendants. The plan of God, is for the people of Israel to be the descendants of Abraham, and immediately that plan gets put into place, it becomes very fragile. Just as the figure of Isaac is seen, Jesus at the crucifixion is seen connected to that figure of Isaac, being crucified. So that the salvation of the world is equally fragile, you know, on the cross. You know, it could just all go wrong and not happen.
Yes, I mean, I think one of the things here is that, you know, I mean, you know, the story has a very long history, and you know, there are, you know, they've got all these very different elements of the story, and they get put together in, you know, in Genesis, but you can still see traces of their background. You know, and you know, and I think one of the parts of the background is a critique of human sacrifice. You know, that's sort of starting from the very end and saying, you know, God looking down and saying, "Oh dear, this man's going to sacrifice his son. What shall we do about that? You know, we've got to stop him doing it." And then there's also, you know, the sort of pre-story of you know, Abraham being pious and devout and being given, you know, and longing for descendants, and then God saying yes to him. And you know, and then there's, you know, when the two of those are put together, then you get something which actually makes very little sense on its own, you know, because you can't actually work out what a coherent state of mind for Abraham is going to be, given, you know, his background and given God's background and so on and so forth. And there is, you know, a rather famous book of philosophy by the Danish 19th century philosopher Kierkegaard about this very thing, and it's called Fear and Trembling. And he, you know, really goes into the question of, you know, is Abraham even thinking anything coherent here?
Okay.
And, you know, and when he's, you know, talking about God's promises and his obedience, is this stuff actually coherent, or is it a bit mad?
I agree.
And is he going this far now because he got it wrong before? You know, when he protested before, he seems to keep on getting things wrong. So is he going, okay, fine, that's what you said?
Yes. That's interesting.
Yes. You know, and I think God's in a way, you know, you know, and Abraham keeps on saying, you know, I now realize what God wants of me, it's X. And then God is sort of thinking, well, let's think up something really sneaky. and you know, and so he, you know, and so Abraham gets us to do, you know, Y, and it just sort of continues going that way.
That's an interesting point about looking back, because we tend to see all the arguing with God as being a good thing, but maybe in the logic of the story it was a bad thing, and this is learning from it that you don't argue with God, and then God has to respond. I mean, it's really interesting seeing the different ways the story can be read, and I think it's important, the point Graham makes about the different elements of it that have been put together, because it's perfectly possible for an anti-child sacrifice strand to be put together with a promise of descendant strand, and the whole thing not actually to make sense in the final product, because they seem to be pulling in two separate directions. And that's perfectly possible, because we know that, and as Vaughan mentioned with the different words for God, we know that there are different strands into different authors in the Old Testament. I mean, I think what I'm wanting to say is that that's really important, but it's also important that we read the story at face value and try to understand it at face value, because that's how a lot of people will read it. And it's important, I think, also to have a sense of how we respond to the person who says, well, look, clearly says there that God wanted Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, and Abraham was willing to, and Abraham is commended for being willing to in the New Testament. This study guide I mentioned encourages role play, and that's something that's something I have got a bit of in the booklet. You probably need a slightly bigger group and a bit more time. But what you might ask Abraham in his role is, why didn't you refuse, or why didn't you protest and argue? How can you explain to us why you kept silent? Why do you seem to be so willing? And I think looking at Abraham as a character in a story without necessarily thinking about the meaning of the different strands of the story, that would be a question that we could well ask Abraham.
It's really interesting, actually, Peter, because there's a type of theatre called forum theatre, which
yes, I know that.
Yeah, okay, that's fine too. No,
because I don't know, I've not heard of it.
It was developed in Brazil by a lovely man called Augusto Boal, and basically it was to help communities kind of discover their own solutions to problems. And what you would do is you'd play out the problem, and then people would you would identify who the main sufferer was. So let's assume that Abraham was the main sufferer rather than Isaac in the story, the person who was most oppressed. You'd then invite people from the audience to get up and have a go at playing his part, and trying to change the story.
Wow.
And seeing what he could have done differently. Many years ago, I did this with a theatre company to see if Peter could avoid denying Jesus.
Wow.
And we found in the end the only way he could really do it, and you could only really find this out through theatre, the only way he could actually avoid denying Jesus was by listening to what Jesus said in the first place, which was, don't follow me, don't come, because as soon as he was there was nothing else that was going to happen except that he would deny that he knew Jesus, or die, one or the other. That was the inevitable consequence. And I'm just thinking, there is a way perhaps you could play with this story in a similar way and just try out where the moments are for Abraham possibly to change this story. But it's almost like it's an internal dialogue. It's not with an external force, it's with himself.
Yeah.
You almost need two Abrahams having an argument on stage.
And the wife coming along.
Yeah, well,
Yes.
Well, there would need to be a moment too where she was there and he could say something to her, but he chooses not to. But what would happen if he did say something,
Sounds good.
I love the idea of forum theatre.
It's brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
Maybe we should try it sometime at Union.
Yeah, I'd love to.
It's really good fun.
If you look at the Bible commentaries, most of them probably seem strangely untroubled by it. One of them suggests that the special circumstance of Abraham's role as the father of the covenant requires a test without parallel. And so you've got the traditional reading of the story being a test to see whether Abraham loved God or Isaac the more. But the point that the commentators don't really seem to get to grips with is the fact that Isaac was a person. And it's really weird. There's so much made of Abraham's faith in God, that he would even give up something that he really, really loved. But Abraham wasn't a car or a career. Isaac wasn't a car or a career or whatever your precious thing is, but was a person. And when you look at the story, Isaac really isn't presented as a person in his own right. He's simply another possession of Abraham. And it's a very strange, given what we believe about God and the importance of every individual, it's a very strange story in that sense too, I think, that Abraham says, well, you kill your son. He's got no say in the matter. And then going back to origin, there's a book by Carol Delaney, which I've got on my bookshelf. If you hold on a minute, I can show you. Called Abraham. No, I can't show. Hang on, I can't see myself, so I can't see where it's. Abraham on Trial, if you can see that.
Yeah.
The social legacy of a biblical myth, and it starts off with a report from an American newspaper about a man who killed his son or his daughter because he believed that.
God told him to.
God was calling him to.
Yeah.
And Delaney has if you're really interested in this story, this is the book to read. It's quite weighty, but well worth reading. And she quotes Origen, who was one of the early church fathers, and he commends Abraham, who, though he loves his son, preferred the love of God to human love.
Mm.
And I think Delaney's point later on in her discussion is really quite pertinent. Her words are in blue. Many believers today would echo Origen's words, so much so that Delaney suggests that we've created what she calls an environment that's made it sacrilegious to question these issues. And I think that's what I sort of want to say, not just about this story, but about some of the other stories we're going to be looking at over the next couple of weeks. That the church has created an environment where it is seen as sacrilegious to ask some fairly basic and wide-ranging questions about stories like this.
Yeah. It's fear, isn't it, really? They're frightened. Frightened of the truth, really.
I think that's another reason I think it's so important for us to do this, because otherwise these stories keep being told, and people... Yeah. I find in churches when I remember in a parish church where we live, parish church we used to go to, talking to an elderly lady in the congregation and having to mention some of the genocide stories in the Old Testament. She says, "Oh, I've always had a problem with those, but I didn't think I could question it." And I think there are a lot more people in the churches who have problems with these stories, but don't feel they can raise the questions that someone's going to tell them off.
No, got to accept them. Yeah. It's in the Bible. Yeah. I agree.
I think there's something really profound in what you've just said as well, Peter, that I'm just starting to realize that I think in certain wings of the church, certainly in teaching I've heard in the past, it's almost like there's an antithesis between God's love and human love. That, you know, it's all very well to have a close relationship with someone on the planet, if you like, but that mustn't, and I have certainly heard this said in this way, that mustn't get in the way of your love for God. And I think it's a massive misunderstanding of God's love being shown through us to each other.
Yeah, definitely.
You know, it's almost like, well, that's all very well, but I love him better. And I've certainly seen that, and that kind of, I can't think of the right word, but oppositional kind of teaching, and I think that's actually really quite profound, because that then leads to making oversimplistic judgments about, you know, well, just reading it at face value, reading as if that's true, then of course it's fine for Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, but it isn't true, is it? God's love is shown to us through each other. That's the best way to find God's love, surely. Yeah,
of course.
And interestingly, Origen appears to have got it wrong right at the beginning, saying, although he loves his son, prefer the love of God to human love. So, yes, as you're saying, Origen right at the start putting a gulf between loving God and loving other human beings. Luther, I always remember, spoke about us being Christ to one another, which I guess is a way of trying to bring the two together. But no, that I think that's such an important point, and I think I've been in circles where that sort of language is used.
Yeah, I believe, doesn't it?
Yes.
That's
and it can lead to so many. Well, it can lead to a love of the abstract instead of a love of the real. You've got a real person in front of you, but actually the abstract, God's glory or God's honor or whatever, is more important than this person who's... I mean, that's probably the reason why some people are able to have such hateful views about LGBT people or want to say, because there's a sense that actually God's honor, the truth, whatever you want to call it, is more important. Love of God is more important than loving this human being that's standing in front of you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Really.
And it's the same dynamic, I think. Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Thank you. So a few more questions. So why is it then that the unprotesting Abraham, prepared to kill his own son at the command of God, why is he presented as the epitome of faithfulness? And I'm sure if we read sermons, if we picked up books of sermons on this, a lot of the sermons would, in the end, say, well, Abraham was a great exemplar of the faith.
I think it's really odd, because it's not, is it? I mean, if you take, the idea that Abraham is to have the descendants, and the descendants become the people of Israel, God's chosen people, then actually he's stopping that in its tracks. So he's actually being faithless to the covenant rather than being faithful.
Interesting.
It's interesting, Graham, you mentioned earlier Kierkegaard, and to my memory, Kierkegaard himself almost gives in to Abraham's insanity. I mean, in that book, I mean, I've been a long time since I read it, but he kind of has this idea of the knight of faith who loses so that he will gain twofold, or something like that. So he sort of had to have believed that that he would still get the descendants, even though it does seem like a kind of, complete conundrum. I don't know. It's been a long time since I read it. But,
it is actually. Kierkegaard wrote a lot of his books under pseudonyms,
and
the
controversial ones, isn't it?
Well, no, not the controversial ones. The ones that he thought were interesting but wrong. He was sort of outlining possibilities of human existence without necessarily saying that people ought to do that. And that was, certainly true of Fear and Trembling.
And also, I mean, I read it again in the past, and not sure I completely understood it, but there's certainly an element in Kierkegaard who's very, very concerned about shocking the sort of very conventional Danish Christianity of his time. And I guess a story like this is very shocking.
Yes.
And that's why he's so keen to write about it and to get people thinking outside the box. And there's a phrase, I can't remember, teleological suspension of the
ethical.
Yes.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
And that's very much about sort of, in theory, being prepared to do something which is unexpected and not apparently the right thing to do in respectable circles. But I don't think it's about respectability we're talking here. It's about actually ethics. And why do you think, I mean, maybe this is more a statement with a question, but Abraham's call to sacrifice Isaac has certainly caught the imagination of generations of Christians, and it's been seen by some as a foreshadowing of the death of Christ.
Because, well, then that makes it easy to excuse God for Christ dying on the cross, doesn't it?
Yeah.
If you put the two together, then that's all right, isn't it?
That's a good point. Yeah. But
it isn't.
If you describe some understandings of the death of Christ as amounting to cosmic child abuse, where then are we left with Abraham and God in this story? So I think what I'm saying is, if you have questions about the idea that God killed his son on the cross, or sent his son to die on the cross, or sacrificed his son on the cross, then where does that leave Abraham and God? I think you're right, Neil, that in a sense the two stories reinforce each other and back each other up. But once you question one, then I wonder if you're questioning both.
And I think they've become a golden calf in the evangelical church. There's a good friend of mine who I won't name, who basically was very much at the center of the evangelical church, and then questioned what God had done with Jesus on the cross, and used the phrase cosmic child abuse, and has been ostracized ever since. It's probably done him a lot of good, actually. But it's how dare he? How dare he even go there? And it's scary when that happens.
People couldn't cope with that, could they?
No.
Yeah.
I suppose the thing is, it does kind of, when it gets really
really bad is when you kind of go, you know, for something like this, you know, I will apply it. You know what I mean? I don't know. It's kind of, you can kind of just read it as a story and say, you know, it's just a story. And when you sort of take it out and say, you know, actually, yes, I will, you know, and God does writes about this as well, actually. You know, yes, I will, you know, display Abraham's faith, and that's when it becomes that's when it becomes quite, you know, and that's when it becomes really sort of really difficult, I think.
I wonder. I mean, you can see why this story of Isaac and Abraham is connected with the death of Christ. I mean, you know, the idea of God sending his son, you know, to die for us. I mean, that's you know, makes the parallel pretty easy to get. But the question then is, you know, what is the point of the incarnation? You know, and what is the atonement then? And it seems to me that it's much more about sharing the vulnerability of our human nature than about God sending a son, thinking that'd be great to see my son getting killed. You know, that would be a nice thing to do for humanity. It's just not. It's just not that at all. It is that, you know, they're going to share this vulnerability. And so actually what Jesus does on the cross is share Isaac's vulnerability.
Yes.
That's an interesting point. Yes. Yes.
And it's now shockingly obvious to me, and I've missed this as a storyteller. This is awful. But of course, it's from two different viewpoints. We don't know God's viewpoint in Jesus's story. Jesus, as Vaughan has said, is Isaac. That's the parallel. But somehow we've completely twisted it. And the other story is about Abraham, who's the equivalent of God. So how can the two reinforce each other? They're completely
Good point.
Oh, what an interesting point. Yeah.
Good point.
I've never seen that before. That's shocking.
Right.
Wow.
I'm just thinking of stuff in Hebrews about this. Actually, interesting to hear about the purpose of. I was just trying to remember it, even though I read it this morning. You know, that he suffers in all things as ourselves. You know, that Christ was tempted in all things and suffered as all things as we ourselves. Yeah.
And then that then, I don't know if this helps at all, but you know, Paul says elsewhere, doesn't he, that how are we to understand the mind of God? So if we're then taking this approach that, you know, Abraham's being commended for his faith, therefore that's like God sending Jesus to the cross, well, that can't be what Paul is saying, because he wouldn't be trying to understand God like that. There's something else going on that we're missing, or I'm missing, but it's got to be something different.
Why do you put so much on Paul? What Paul says?
Well, I'm just saying so.
Is that important? Whatever Paul says.
Maybe not. No, okay, fair point.
But there is something in the Abraham story, though. I mean, you know, I know that aside from all the testing stuff, you know, there is this thing about God providing. You know, God providing the alternative. And in that sense, you know, if you look at it, the crucifixion story, you know, that it is God who raises Jesus from the dead. You know, that the story moves through from this terrible kind of awful, obscene, you know, beginning into something that then becomes, yes, the descendants do come, that the child sacrifice is changed into, you know, another form of sacrifice, and so on, so on, so on. So, and that God then becomes a God who provides, you know, provides manna in the wilderness, provides, you know, for our needs.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things is that, I mean, one of the big questions here is what does faith mean? And you know, there is this, you know, sometimes overwhelming assumption that faith actually means believing something which you're just told about by God and which you have no evidence for. but also, there's an element of, and that's, I suppose, in some way what faith is about, but also there's the idea that faith is trust.
Yes.
And that, and that Abraham goes on this awful journey with Isaac, and he trusts God. And when people sort of say to him, "Isn't this wrong?" he says, "God will provide."
Yes, you just said that.
A final question here. What are we supposed to do with this story, given its place in the Bible and Abraham's subsequent commendation in the New Testament? Any thoughts about what we do with it? I mean, I guess you can't edit it from the Bible. If we edited all the bits like this from the Bible, we won't be that much left.
I know what I want to do. I want to say to Sue, tell this from a mother's perspective.
Oh.
And then all these stories that have been so much from the patriarchy over the centuries, tell them from the mother's perspective. What are the blokes missing?
Yeah, good idea. It's a good role playing. Definitely.
I don't know if that's the right answer or what, but
No, it's one answer. I like that idea.
I mean, there's something, if you go on, if you're interested in these sorts of things, we have a preacher's blog on the website where this booklet is. And a few months ago, we had somebody writing something about imaginative empathy as a way of trying to understand some of the stories in the Old Testament from a different perspective.
Yeah. Do you know Wilfred Owen's poem?
Sorry?
Do you know Wilfred Owen's poem?
No.
Abraham. It's Wilfred Owen, First World War poet, and he tells the story in poetic form. He tells the story exactly as it is in Genesis, and then he ends it by saying, "But the old man would not sow, and slew his son, and half the seed of Europe one by one."
Oh wow!
So and in that sense, I think that's why where the change becomes important. That shift in the story in Genesis becomes really important. And what Wilfred Owen was saying was, look, the human sacrifices are being made here. He was writing, in the midst of the First World War as a soldier. And I think that, I think where we make it is, if we want to make something positive out of the story, we have to say, look, the sacrifices are being made, and children are being sacrificed, all over the world today, in terrible circumstances. And what could have happened to Isaac is happening to hundreds of thousands of children around the world. But actually, God provides and stops it in this story. It may not be our first reaction, but actually, if we're going to take anything from it, I think that's
I don't think most fathers would kill their sons.
No.
Sorry, go on.
No, of course they wouldn't. No, but I mean, I think humanity is sacrificing children.
Yeah, I understand.
All over the place. I mean, not just one little stories, micro stories about families, but our human race is killing children in all kinds of ways. So God has to provide some alternative. We have hope that God will.
Yes, thank you. Definitely.
And to really bring that home, if you applied that to children in boats crossing the channel.
Yes.
What are we prepared to do because of what we believe?
Yeah. Or told to believe.
Yeah.
And and there will be Christians in the United States who are quite happy to see migrants imprisoned and separated from their parents, and all of that.
Yeah, well, that yeah, and
Don't start that.
I was just trying to think about what do we do in this country that we're right now abusively talking about.
Wow.
I thought this cartoon sort of summed it up quite well. It's humorous but quite profound. So that's one way we could retell the story.
Very good.
So I mean, just put 3 questions for further reflection. We got time just to say something about these now, but it may be ones to reflect on afterwards as well. In light of your reading reflection on the story, how would you approach it now? How do you think the Christian community should read and explain it in future? And what other questions does your reading and reflection on the story raise for you? So if any of those 3 questions immediately provoke a response, just do share it with us. We've got about 5 minutes before we wind down.
To be honest, I do like Vaughan's sort of perspective. Like, the fact is that, you know, during the writing of this story, child sacrifice was a reality.
Yes.
And this story essentially does show a movement away from that. And that's sort of quite a big deal.
Yes.
So to say that this, you know, to sort of read this as if it wasn't written in a culture where child sacrifice was already somewhat normal, then you sort of have a perspective of it, that you're going to have a perspective of it that's much more brutal than the story might have been in the context of the
Yes.
But
that's a good point, actually. Yes, it's like when we think about genocide next week, the sort of things that it's describing are things that are really a big deal for us, but not that many generations ago, it wouldn't have been such a big deal at all. So it's in a sense, our moral expectations have changed too. And that's a really important point.
I mean,
yeah, sorry. No.
No, I mean, I think your second question, how do you think the Christian community should read and explain the story in the future? I think what you've done tonight is say, we're not going to take this at face value. You know, we have permission to dig deeper into this story, and we have permission to say, no, we don't like what it seems to be said here, but actually we can draw something that is very relevant to where we are today, and we have permission to do that.
Yes. Yes. Thank you.
Well done, Vaughan. That's really interesting, Peter. Thank you so much. It's really good.
Yeah.
Really enjoyed it.
Next week, look, you may remember the little slide at the top. I couldn't resist that when I found it on Google. But Deuteronomy 7, occupying the promised land. It's not the only passage. In fact, I think I've suggested too that we read, Deuteronomy. Well, they'll be on the website, but there are a number of places where genocide appears to be commanded, and so we'll look at those and think about those next week.
Really good. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.
My pleasure. It's been a really good discussion. Thank you all for your contribution.
Thank you.
Anything anybody wants to say to finish with?
Very drawn towards Sue's idea of a female perspective being written and performed.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
You've got 5 minutes next week, Sue.
I'm really interested in the idea of forum theatre. I shall look that up this evening when we finish.
Definitely. Good.
I'd love to see that in action. I think that sounds really interesting. One of the things I've been involved with a little bit is bibliodrama, which is not dissimilar sort of process. And the most memorable bibliodramas was one I went to on the story of the wise and foolish virgins. And you did a bit of role play, and I chose to take one of the role of the foolish virgins because I always feel they're really, really hard done by. And I wanted to ask the wise virgins why they were so mean. So there are ways which you can very creatively engage with some of these stories.
Great idea.
And so, I'd be very interested to hear of any examples, opportunities to do that. Well, that's probably it. But as I say, thank you all again for sharing so much and so openly and honestly. It's been great.
Yes,
you.
enjoyed it. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you, Peter.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Like that.
Good night, everybody.
Very much.
Okay, bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Next week.
Next week.
See you next week.
Bye bye.
Bye.